Welcome to the Painting Coach, and today we are painting the greatest swordsman in the galaxy. Allegedly, it is the brand new Lucius the Eternal model from Games Workshop. A huge thank you to them for sending me the model early to create this content. So without any further ado, let's get painting. So I've built the model and I've primed the model using Chaos Black spray. Now the first thing I've done is take some watered down Abaddon Black and paint all of the panels that are going to be that colour. That's just to make it easier for when I have to make any corrections later on. The first thing we're going to do is paint all of the silver metallic areas, and the colour I'm using for this is dark aluminium from Vallejo Metal Colour. You can use lead belcher or Surcoat silver, whichever one you've got. What we're looking to do here is paint things like the sword blade, all of the trim on Lucius, as well as any little spikes that might be silver later on. Now, you can be fairly messy with this, but the tidier you are, the less cleanup you'll need to do. Next up, we'll base all of the gold, and I'm using Dragon's Gold from Two Thin Coats, but if you haven't got this, Retributor Armour is exactly the same shade, so it's perfect as well. In terms of what I'm looking to do, there's not a huge amount of gold, but there's the hilt and that really cool handle that we've got on the sword. We've also got some of the icons hanging from his waist, and of course, we've got the tops of all those canisters that Lucius has got on his backpack. Now we'll shade the silver and the gold at the same time. If you've watched any of my Emperor's Children videos, you'll know that I love to shade them with Druchii Violet. So I'm just going to paint this all over those metallic areas, making sure it settles in the recesses. Now I don't want to apply it too heavily so I get a massively dark purple pool. I just want to use it to stain the areas, so it just gives that hint of purple, which I think is perfect for the Emperor's Children. Next, we'll get on to highlighting, and we'll do the gold first. So I'm going to use some Glistening Gold from Two Thin Coats. If you haven't got this, then Liberator Gold from Citadel is absolutely fine. Generally, what I'm looking to do this is paint it on the areas that are facing upwards, as those are the ones that are going to catch the most light. Now, because of the shape of the model, generally you can drag the brush to get some nice crisp highlights. So just take your time with this and make sure you don't spill any on those silver areas. Next up, we'll highlight all the silver, and the colour I'm using for this is Chrome from Vallejo Model Air. Now, generally, all of the silver edges are fairly sharp and fairly easy to get crisp highlights on just by dragging your brush. So make sure you've got a good point on it and you haven't got too much paint on it. Then all you need to do is drag it across those sharp edges, and this gives you a really nice crisp highlight. Next up, we'll do all of the leather. So we've got things like the belt, we've got the strapping across Lucius's legs, and he also seems to be wearing some sort of leather bodice as well. So we're going to use some Dryad Bark for this, which is a nice dark desaturated brown. I'll then take some Nuln oil and use this to shade all of the leather, making sure that it gets into all of the recesses. Now, normally when I'm doing a leather this colour, I don't bother shading because I don't think you need it, but I do just want to add a little bit more depth on Lucius. When that's completely dry, we'll go back in with Dryad Bark and start to highlight everything up. Now, generally, this is going to mean dragging the brush along any sharp edges, very much like we did with the silver. So it's important that you haven't got too much paint on your brush. Now, there are fairly angular bits as well, so you should be able to get a nice crisp highlight. To finish up that leather, we'll take some Gorthor Brown. Now, this needs to be a very fine highlight, and we want to keep it inside the Dryad Bark of the previous stage. So what we're looking to do here, again, very little paint on the brush, good tip. And we're looking to just drag it across those sharp edges. And that's going to give us a really nice highlight, and it's going to help that leather stand up quite nicely. Next up, we'll paint all of the flayed flesh elements that Lucius has on his body. So we've got that loincloth, we've got the wrap around the one greave, we've also got a little bit across the back of the backpack as well. So the colour I'm using for this is Rakarth Flesh. I'm just looking to get a nice solid coat with this. So it might take 2 or 3 coats, but just take your time, use thin paint so you don't clog up any detail. Next up, we're going to shade all of those fleshy areas. Now, I do want to add a little bit of variation so that it's not all exactly the same. So for that loincloth, I'm going to take some Berserker Bloodshade and I'm going to paint this all over that area, making sure it goes into the recesses. On the backpack and that greave, I'm going to take some Druchii Violet. So this is going to give me more of a purple hue to those particular bits of flayed flesh, rather than the reddy, bloody hue that we've got on the other elements. So all I'm looking to do is paint this across it again, not going in too heavily and shading it too deeply. We're just looking to stain it with purple, particularly in the recesses. And that Slaanesh icon that's carved into the backpack, we want to make sure that we get plenty of wash into that. Next up, we're going to highlight those areas, and we're going to do them roughly the same, but there is a slight variation for the first layer. So for that loincloth and the little bit of wrapped up flesh that Lucius has got on his belt, we're going to take Rakarth Flesh and we're going to stipple this across those areas, across those raised parts. So this is just going to help build up that highlight and just give the impression of like dead mottled flesh rather than going for nice thin smooth highlights, which I don't think is particularly suited and doesn't really suit the kind of body horror aesthetic that you've got with some of the choices, shall we say, on the Emperor's Children. For the areas that we shaded with Druchii Violet, we're going to take some Druchii Violet and make a 50-50 mix of Druchii Violet and Rakarth Flesh. And then we're going to go in and stipple highlight these areas like we did with the loincloth. Now, the reason I've mixed some Druchii Violet into the Rakarth Flesh is to just make that first highlight a lot more subtle. And this will really help with getting a nice transition on these areas when it comes to final highlights later on. We're doing the same technique. We are stippling. Now, this paint will be a bit thinner as well, so you need to make sure you haven't got a huge amount on your brush, and it might be worth dabbing it on a paper towel before you go to the model. Once that's dry, I'll then go back in with pure Rakarth Flesh over those same areas, really focusing on the higher, most prominent parts of that flesh. And again, just stippling that highlight across to get a nice transition from the darker purple to a slightly lighter highlight with the Rakarth Flesh. And again, I hope you can see this in the video, and if you're painting it yourself, that transition is a lot more subtle than the one we've got on the loincloth and that little bit coming down from his belt. The final highlight we put on all of the flayed flesh areas is going to be with Pallid Witch Flesh. And we're going to use exactly the same technique with this. We're going to stipple this across those most raised folds and where we think we're going to get the biggest highlight. So use this fairly subtly to start with. You can always go back in and add more. But I think doing it this way really does just give you a much more ragged, a much more damaged effect. Next, we'll move on to Lucius's whip and his tongue. And to do this, we're going to base everything using Screamer Pink. So take your time around some of those silver areas you've already finished. But otherwise, it's fairly easy. Just go in and paint the entirety of the whip with Screamer Pink and also Lucius's tongue. And there's also another tongue coming out of his one shoulder pad as well, which we're going to paint with this colour. The first thing we'll do when that's completely dry is shade everything we've just painted with Screamer Pink with Drakenhoff Nightshade. Now, this will give you a really nice shade, and it'll also start to look a little bit purple in some areas. We're going to use that to our advantage for the next step once everything's dry. So once everything's dry, we're probably going to paint about a half of the whip with a second coat of Drakenhoff Nightshade. And it's really important that it is dry at this point. So paint that on there, and what I'm also going to do is before it's dry, is I'm going to clean my brush off, make sure it's just damp, and then I'm going to feather in the bottom part. So where the two layers join, I'm just going to feather that out a little bit to make that transition a little bit smoother. And then as this starts to dry, you'll see the top half of the whip with the scorpion tails is really a nice dark purple, but you've still got that Screamer Pink effect on the lower areas where it goes into the shoulder pad, where it's much lighter. So to start highlighting, we'll go back to Screamer Pink. What we're looking to do is make the whip lighter the closer to that shoulder pad and Lucius's hand that it gets, and darker the further away from Lucius. So I'm going to start the highlighting in the area of the shoulder pad and around Lucius's hand, because that's where it's going to be brightest. And I'm going to extend it about halfway up the length of the whip. And what I'm looking to do when I'm getting up towards that halfway mark of the whip is pull the highlights back towards Lucius's hand, because that means that's where the most amount of paint is going to be deposited, and it should leave a more crisp highlight. Now, the good thing about the whip, it's very textured, so you can drag your brush and get nice crisp highlights. The next highlight we'll put on the whip and Lucius's tongue is going to be with Pink Horror. And again, we're going to start by focusing this on the shoulder pad and around Lucius's hand. And this is probably going to go about halfway down the whip again. So about a quarter of the whip is going to be with Pink Horror. And again, we're going to draw our highlights back through the Screamer Pink into those big Pink Horror elements, because that's just going to give us a little bit more of a smoother transition. And we're really going to focus adding a good amount of this towards that shoulder pad. So we're going to layer it up really nicely. The next highlight on that whip is going to be with Emperor's Children, which is a nice bright pink colour. And we're looking to focus this really just around the hand area of Lucius, picking up all that texture that we've got on the whip, particularly towards the shoulder pad. We might take a few stray highlights out towards the end of the whip a little bit, but there's not a huge need to do this. And if we do a little bit much, it will look a bit silly. So just focus it around all that texture we've got around the bendy bits. The last highlight we'll do on this part of the whip is a 50-50 mix of Kislev Flesh and Emperor's Children. And what we're looking to do here is just paint the areas coming out of the shoulder pad, picking up the nice sharp lines and also any of that texture, just to give it a little bit of a transition into more of a fleshy colour as it reaches the shoulder pad. As for the rest of the whip, we need to highlight some of the purple on there, and the colour I'm going to use for this is Xereus Purple. And what I'm looking to do is drag my brush along the shape of the whip, and this will give me a really nice purple highlight. I'm also looking to push this highlight back into the Screamer Pink, and what you'll start to see is that you get a really nice transition between the Screamer Pink into that Xereus Purple. Whilst I've got the Xereus Purple out, I'm also going to base Lucius's head and his hands, because he hasn't got gloves on, he's barehanded, so we're going to paint those purple too. The final highlight we'll pop on the whip is with Genestealer Purple, and we want to keep this inside the Xereus Purple from the previous stage. So make sure you haven't got a huge amount on your brush and just drag it along those sharp elements. We're also going to paint this all over Lucius's head and his hands again. It's the Genestealer Purple that's really going to be the main base for those colours, so don't worry about covering up all of the Xereus Purple we've already put down. So we'll start to highlight up the head and the hands, and the first colour we're going to use for this is Warpfiend Grey. And generally, we're going to paint the entirety of those areas, leaving the Genestealer Purple in the recesses. So we're going to leave it in all of the cracks, all of the scarring on Lucius's head, and we're also going to leave it in the recesses between the fingers, just to give us that purple shade. But generally, the Warpfiend Grey is going to make these areas much lighter, and that's what we really want. Next up, we'll use some Slaanesh Grey, which again is a lighter colour, and it would be rude to paint Emperor's Children without using Slaanesh Grey. And what we're looking to do here is really focus the highlights a bit more. So we're going to focus this around Lucius's cheekbones, his brow, what's left of his nose and his jaw. But we're also going to use it to highlight the scarring across his head. And similarly, with the hands and the fingers, we're looking to keep this inside the Warpfiend Grey of the previous step. To add a little bit more of some brightness to these areas, I'm going to take a 50-50 mix of AK White and Slaanesh Grey. Now, if you've got White Scar, that's absolutely fine. And we're going to use this fairly sparingly, just towards the top of Lucius's head, just to accentuate things like his cheekbone, his knuckles on the hands. And the other thing I'm going to do with this very carefully is just dot it onto Lucius's eyes, because this will give us a really nice, bright eye. So next up, it's time to paint all those canisters on Lucius's backpack. So the first thing I'm going to do is base all of them using a very dark green. So I'm going to use Caliban Green. Now, whilst I'm also basing the glass in the canisters, I'm also going to base all of the tubing running from the canisters into Lucius's head. And there's also some tubing running across his torso along the back as well. First up, we'll paint the green canisters. Now, if I look at the box art, there's some green canisters and like a bluey green canister, so we'll go for that. The colour I'm going to use for this is Warpstone Glow, and what I'm looking to do is show the level of this liquid moving a little bit with Lucius's angle. So what I want to do is paint the line in the glass jar parallel with the base, regardless of the angle of Lucius. This just helps sell the fact that it's liquid and it's moving around in there. So for that middle canister, I'm going to paint it maybe about halfway full. For the canister next to it, I'm going to do it completely full. And then for the other canister on Lucius's right side, I'm probably going to put this half full as well. It probably will take 2 coats of the Warpstone Glow here, so don't rush it. I'm also going to use the Warpstone Glow to highlight all of the tubing. Next up, we'll take some Moot Green. What we're looking to do is highlight everything. So we're going to be fairly accurate here, so we need to be quite sharp. So a good tip on our brush, not too much paint. Now on all the tubing, I'm going to paint this inside the Warpstone Glow from the last step. When it comes to the canisters, what I'm looking to do is 2 things. Firstly, I'm looking to highlight the top of the liquid, because that gives me the impression that there's a little bit of a glow across the top there. The other thing I'm looking to do is instate some reflection on the glass. So I'm going to paint some vertical lines down the canisters, covering the dark into the lighter colour, and that's going to be my first highlight on the glass. The next highlight I'm going to do is with AK White, and this is going to be a highlight only on the canisters. So what I'm looking to do is just get a very fine point on my brush and paint this inside that vertical Moot Green line from the previous step. So make sure you haven't got too much on. This might take a little bit of time and practice and patience, but you want a nice thin white line. Moving on to the slightly bluey green canisters, the first thing we're going to do is base the liquid using Sybarite Green. Now, even though this is a very light layer paint, it does cover actually quite nicely when I put it on here. So I only needed one coat, but just be aware you might need two. Again, we're going to paint the top of that liquid parallel with the base. The first highlight and first reflection I'm going to do is with Gauss Blaster Green. That's exactly the same step we did with the Moot Green in the previous stage. So we're going to highlight the top of the liquid and put a nice thin vertical line. Once that's done, I'm going to go back in with the AK White. Now, I didn't film this bit, but just a nice thin line of AK White like we did for the Moot Green. So we'll paint Lucius's armour next, and the first thing to do if you haven't done it is go back in with Abaddon Black and just fix any mistakes that you may have made working across the model. Now there are two parts to Lucius's armour, and we'll handle these slightly differently. So first up, we'll do all of the normal style armour, and then I'll show you how to do the anguished faces that have been transfigured into Lucius's armour. So for the normal armour, we'll take some Eshin Grey, and what we're looking to do here is an edge highlight. Now this can be a fairly chunky highlight, but if you do put it on a little bit too fat, you can always go back in with some Abaddon Black and just tidy it up really nicely. Next up, we'll continue highlighting the armour using Dawnstone. Now the key with the Dawnstone is to keep this inside the Eshin Grey from the previous step. So this needs to be a nice fine highlight. So you can see I've got a very good tip on my brush and not very much paint on there at all. And this is really useful in terms of getting some control. Now, if you do make any mistakes, you can obviously go back in and tidy up. But generally, this is a fairly straightforward step. There's lots of sharp points on the armour as well, where we can just drag the tip of the brush to get those crisp highlights. Next up, we'll highlight all of the anguished faces and slightly organic parts to Lucius's armour. Now, if you don't know about Lucius's backstory, he is allegedly the greatest swordsman in the galaxy. Now, if anyone defeats him in single hand-to-hand combat, if they take even a tiny bit of satisfaction, they start to transform into Lucius, and Lucius is reborn with their head, their anguished head as a trophy now becoming part of his armor. It's quite disgusting, but it's quite a cool backstory. So the first highlight we're going to use on all of this is Skavenblight Dinge, because we're going for a slightly more organic look. Next up, we'll continue highlighting using Stormvermin Fur. Now, this is going to give you a much warmer highlight than the neutral grey highlight that you would have got with the armour. So generally with this, we're looking to pick out only the sharp edges of those anguished faces as they're pulling through the armour. This should help this element take shape, and we are going to just give it a little bit of colour in a moment once we've done the final highlight, just to help them stand out a bit further. The final highlight is a 50-50 mix of Karak Stone and Stormvermin Fur, and this is just to really highlight those elements that are popping out of Lucius's armour, just to help a little bit in terms of giving them some differentiation so it doesn't look like a black blob on the tabletop. To further enhance this and just give them a little bit more warmth, we're going to take some Druchii Violet and paint these over some of the highlighted areas. Now, this is going to give you a slightly purple hue to some of these heads, and that's going to just work nicely, again, in terms of helping with some differentiation. And there we have it. Lucius the Eternal is done and ready for the tabletop. I'm really happy with how elements of this have come out, in particular those glass canisters on Lucius's backpack and also his snarling scarred face. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like and a comment down below, and don't forget to check out my other Emperor's Children content, including this amazing Fulgrim tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.